On the night of May 20th, 1631, the sky over the city of Magdeburg turned orange. Not from sunset, from fire. 40,000 soldiers broke through the walls of a city that had stood proud on the banks of the Elbe River for 800 years, and by the next morning, out of roughly 25,000 people who had gone to sleep the night before, fewer than 5,000 were still breathing. The rest were dead, or dying in the ashes of what used to be their homes. German chroniclers at the time called it Magdeburg's wedding, a grim little joke about a marriage between a city and a fire. Later generations just called it the day the city died. And here is the strange part. Ask almost anyone today, in Germany or anywhere else, what happened between the years 1618 and 1648, and you will get a shrug, maybe a vague mention of something, with a long name and no real details attached to it. Compare that to how much airtime the 20th century's wars get. The documentaries, the films, the school curriculums built entirely around them, and this earlier catastrophe barely gets a footnote, not because it was small, because it was so big, so long, and so relentlessly brutal that it somehow got buried under the wars that came centuries later. This is the 30 Years' War, and it did something no war before or since ever managed to do to the German lands. It erased somewhere between a fifth and a third of the entire population. In parts of Mecklenburg, Pomerania, and Thuringia, historians estimate the losses ran even higher, closer to half. Entire villages simply stopped existing. Parish registers that had run unbroken for generations just end, mid-sentence, sometime in the 1630s, and never start again under the same names. Some towns that had thousands of residents before the war were counting their survivors in the low hundreds by the time it finally ended, and never fully recovered their old size for well over a century afterward. But some names did survive, and if you are watching this in Germany, in Wisconsin, in Sao Paulo, in a quiet suburb outside Toronto, carrying a surname that came out of those 30 brutal years, you are not just carrying a word your family happened to keep. You are carrying the outcome of a decision somebody made 4 centuries ago that kept a bloodline breathing when every statistic said it shouldn't have. Stick around, because the name at number 1 belongs to a man who watched his own city burn to the ground, lost his own son in the chaos, and went on to become one of the most important scientists Germany has ever produced. Before we get into it, hit that subscribe button right now, because this channel is going to keep pulling names like these out of the archives, and you genuinely do not want to miss the next one landing in your feed. Here is what you need to understand about this war before the countdown starts. It began in 1618, with 2 royal officials getting thrown out of a window in Prague over a religious and political dispute that should have stayed local and instead pulled in nearly every major power in Europe. It did not stop for 30 years. Somewhere along the way, armies stopped being armies in the way we think of them today. They became traveling cities, 15, 20, even 40,000 people strong, feeding themselves off whatever land they marched through, because no treasury on earth, not even the Habsburg treasury, could pay that many mercenaries for 3 straight decades. Commanders started collecting what they called contributions, regular forced payments extracted from towns and regions, simply to keep an army from burning the place down. It was protection money, dressed up in military language, and it became the actual economic engine of the war. That single fact changed everything about who lived and who didn't. Survival stopped being about walls or weapons alone. It came down to whether your family's trade was one an army needed, whether your town had money to pay for its own safety, or whether the man leading the soldiers through your village happened to share your family name. The next 10 names on this list belong to the ordinary families who found a way through those 30 years. The final 10 belong to the men who decided, quite literally, who got to survive at all. Number 20, Bauer. It simply means farmer, and farmers took the very first hit every single time an army crossed into new territory, because soldiers ate before they did anything else. But here is what the regional record books actually show. Villages with strong Bauer households, families who buried their grain in the fields at night, moved their livestock into the forest the moment dust appeared on the horizon, and organized themselves to negotiate as a group instead of scattering in panic, came out the other side of the war in far greater numbers than villages that didn't organize at all. If your name is Bauer, your ancestors were very likely the ones still standing in the field, tools in hand, when the smoke finally cleared, and the ones who fed the surviving villages back to health in the decades that followed. Number 19. Schmidt, the blacksmith. And here's the twist, almost nobody mentions. Armies on the move needed horses shod and steel repaired, constantly, on a daily basis, which meant a working forge was sometimes worth more to a passing regiment than anything it could loot and carry off. Regional muster records from Franconia and Saxony describe smiths being pulled into service alongside the army, rather than left behind for other soldiers to rob, which, brutal as it sounds when you say it plainly, kept plenty of Schmidt households alive and working when their neighbors weren't nearly as fortunate, and it's a large part of why this remains one of the most common surnames in Germany today. Number 18. Müller, the miller. Flour meant bread, and bread meant an army could keep marching without starving, so mills were treated less like targets and more like assets worth actively guarding. Local chronicles from the Rhineland describe commanders posting their own sentries at mills for the specific purpose of stopping other soldiers, sometimes even their own men, from burning them down out of habit. If your name is Müller, there is a real chance your family's mill was the one structure in the entire village both sides quietly agreed was worth keeping standing. Number 17. Fischer. Fishing families along the Elbe, the Rhine, and the Great Lakes of southern Germany had something almost nobody else in the countryside had: a way out that didn't require a horse, a cart, or a road at all. When word arrived that troops were approaching, riverside and lakeside communities could load everything they owned into a boat and simply vanish onto open water in a way landlocked farmers could never manage. Records from villages along the Bodensee describe entire populations rowing out at night and waiting, sometimes for days, until the soldiers moved on to somewhere else. Number 16. Vogt, an old word for a local administrator, a bailiff who ran the daily business of a town or district on behalf of its lord. This was the job that actually sat down face to face with an enemy commander and hammered out the terms of those contributions we mentioned earlier, the payments that bought a town its safety instead of its destruction. It is one of the least talked about reasons entire regions of Germany survived this war relatively intact, and if your name is Vogt, your ancestor may well have been the one sitting across that table doing the negotiating. The judge. When a town chose to surrender rather than fight to the last man, someone had to actually draft the terms, what soldiers could and could not take, which buildings and churches were off limits, what happened to the civilians left inside the walls. Those documents, known as capitulations, existed all across the German lands during this war, and the men who wrote and then enforced them determined, at least on paper, whether a surrender actually meant safety or just a slower death. Number 14. Kruger, the innkeeper. Inns became something close to neutral ground during the war, the place where officers billeted for the night, where messages passed quietly between opposing sides, and where terms of surrender got discussed over a table instead of decided at the point of a pike. A town with an active inn housing an officer often found itself spared the very worst of the looting, purely because there was already somebody staying there with a personal reason to keep the place standing. Number 13. Zimmermann, the carpenter. This is the name that mattered most after the war ended, rather than during it. When the guns finally went quiet in October of 1648, Germany didn't just have 30 years of war behind it. It had 30 years worth of barns, bridges, churches, and entire town centers that needed to be rebuilt from nothing. The decades that followed turned carpentry into one of the single most in-demand trades on the continent, and the families who carried that name effectively carried the physical reconstruction of the German lands on their backs. Number 12. Wagner, the wagon maker. Every army that crossed German soil in this war moved on wheels, food, gunpowder, tents, and wounded men, all of it hauled behind horses, on wagons that broke down constantly, on roads that were barely roads at all by this point in the war. Wagoners and wagon builders traveled with armies almost as often as soldiers themselves did, which meant this particular trade, more than most, placed you inside the machinery of the war rather than helplessly in its path. Being useful to a passing army, it turns out, was a far better survival strategy than being invisible to one. Number 11. Weber, the Weaver. Textile towns like Augsburg had something the surrounding countryside simply didn't have: real money, and lots of it. Wealthy towns could do what poor villages never could: pay enormous ransoms directly to commanders to avoid being sacked outright. It wasn't loyalty or luck that saved these towns in the end. It was cold, hard cash. And the weaving families who generated that wealth in the first place were, indirectly, buying their own survival with every bolt of cloth they wove and sold. If your name has shown up anywhere so far, drop it in the comments below, because we are about to move into the 10 names that didn't just survive this war. These are the names of the men who decided who else got to. Number 10. Fugger. This is the banking dynasty that financed half the crowned heads of Europe, including the Habsburg emperors who ran the Catholic side of this entire conflict. When Spain and the Empire began defaulting on their debts in the middle of the war, the Fuggers absorbed financial losses that would have destroyed almost any other family outright, and yet they had men fighting in the war itself at the very same time. Otto Heinrich Fugger served as an imperial soldier through some of the war's worst campaigns, present at battles like Nördlingen, and later governed the city of Augsburg. If your name is Fugger, your bloodline bankrolled a war and bled in it at the same time. Number 9. Falkenberg. Dietrich von Falkenberg was the officer sent to organize Magdeburg's defense in the months before the fire we opened this video with. He held those walls as long as any commander realistically could have, refusing every demand to surrender, and when the city finally fell on the morning of May 20th, 1631, he was shot dead in the very streets he had sworn to protect. His name is written into nearly every surviving account of that siege, almost always in the same sentence as the words, "died defending." If your name is Falkenberg, you carry the name of a man who didn't survive the war himself, but whose final stand is a large part of why we still know exactly what happened that terrible day, and why the world took notice at all. Number 8. Arnhem. Hans-Georg von Arnim might be the single best example of how nearly impossible it was to pick one side in this war and actually stay on it. He fought for Sweden, then for Poland, then joined Wallenstein's imperial army and rose to field marshal, then switched to Saxony, was later kidnapped by his own former Swedish allies, and hauled off to a prison in Stockholm on suspicion of secretly plotting against them, escaped, and spent his final years trying to organize German princes into throwing every single foreign army off German soil. He died suddenly in Dresden in 1641, still trying. If your name is Arnhem, your bloodline survived this war by simply refusing to stay loyal to any one flag long enough to go down with it. Number 7. Wrangel. Carl Gustav Wrangel came from an old noble family of the Baltic coast, and by the war's final years, he commanded the combined Swedish and French army that finally broke the last serious imperial resistance at the Battle of Zusmarshausen in 1648, mere weeks before peace was even formally signed. He went on to become one of the wealthiest and most powerful men in the entire Swedish Empire: admiral, field marshal, and royal counselor. If your name is Wrangel, your bloodline didn't just survive the war, it came out the other side owning a considerable piece of it: castles, estates, and titles that stayed in the family for generations afterward. Number 6. Holk. Heinrich Holk was the General Wallenstein sent to punish the electorate of Saxony after it turned against the empire, and Holk did not carry out that punishment gently. His men tore through Saxon towns and villages with a reputation so brutal that the phrase, "Holk's men are coming," became its own kind of warning, one that emptied entire villages faster than almost any other single name attached to this war. If your name is Holk, your bloodline is tied to exactly one of the reasons so many other families on this very list had to run for their lives in the first place. Number 5. Königsmark. In the summer of 1648, while diplomats gathered in Westphalia were putting the final clauses of a 30-year peace onto paper, a Swedish commander of German origin named Hans Christoph von Königsmark decided there was still time for one more raid. He stormed Prague Castle and walked out with the art collection Emperor Rudolf II had spent decades painstakingly assembling: manuscripts, paintings, and treasures that are still sitting inside Swedish royal collections today, The war technically hadn't even ended yet when he did it. If your name is Königsmark, your bloodline pulled off arguably the single boldest heist of the entire 30 Years' War, timed to the very last weeks of the fighting, and some of what he carried off is still on display in Stockholm to this day. Number 4. Melander. Here's one almost nobody knows. He was born Peter Eppelman, the son of a farmer from a small village near Hadamar, and rose so far through the ranks of this war that he was eventually made an imperial count and given the elegant, Hellenized name Melander to match his new noble status. He fought for the Protestant side for years, commanded troops for Hesse Castle, then switched allegiance entirely and ended up commanding the empire's own army, an extraordinary climb for a man whose father had been a plain tenant farmer. In May of 1648, at the Battle of Zusmarshausen, one of the very last major engagements of the entire war, he threw himself into the thick of the fighting and was shot twice, in the chest and the shoulder. He died of those wounds days later in the city of Augsburg. If your name is Melander, your bloodline rose from a farmhouse floor to command an emperor's army, and paid the full price for it in the war's final weeks. Number 3. Pappenheim. Gottfried Heinrich von Pappenheim led the cavalry charge that finally broke into Magdeburg on that terrible day in May of 1631, and his name is forever tied to the fire that followed. But more than a year later, in November of 1632, he rode onto the battlefield at Lutzen, just in time to change the entire shape of the fight, arriving with his cavalry at exactly the right moment, and was mortally wounded doing it. He died from those wounds within days, in the very same battle where the enemy king, Gustavus Adolphus of Sweden, was also killed outright. Two of the war's most famous commanders, both dead from the same single battle, only days apart from one another. If your name is Pappenheim, your bloodline is written into both the single worst massacre of this war and one of its bloodiest, most decisive battles. Number 2. Wallenstein. For a stretch of years in the 1620s and early 1630s, this was arguably the most powerful private citizen anywhere in Europe. Wallenstein raised and personally financed an entire imperial army out of his own fortune, extracted contributions from occupied territory to keep it funded and fed, and became so wealthy and so politically independent that the emperor he served eventually started fearing him more than he feared the actual enemy on the battlefield. In February of 1634, acting on secret orders sent from Vienna, a group of imperial officers cornered him in the small Bohemian town of Eger and killed him in the middle of the night, along with several of his closest allies and friends. The playwright Friedrich Schiller would later turn the whole affair into one of the great tragedies of German literature, more than a century after it actually happened. If your name is Wallenstein, your bloodline once commanded more soldiers than most crowned kings in Europe, and was ultimately murdered by the very side it had spent years fighting for. And number 1, Gericke. In May of 1631, a young Magdeburg city councilman in his 20s watched soldiers burn his home to the ground and hold his entire family for ransom in the chaos of the sack. One of his own young sons was wounded that day and later died of the injury. The man survived only by handing over every single possession he owned, and once the ransom was finally paid, he and his wife walked out of the smoking ruins with absolutely nothing left to their name. His name was Otto Gericke, and instead of that being the end of his story, it turned out to be the very beginning of it. He returned to help physically rebuild the city from ash, was eventually elected its mayor, and spent his later years conducting scientific experiments that would go on to change the world, most famously proving the existence of a true vacuum by using 2 teams of horses, 16 animals in total, that couldn't pull apart a pair of hollow metal spheres once the air between them had been removed, a demonstration he staged in front of a Holy Roman Emperor to make absolutely sure the point landed. A man who lost nearly everything in this war's single worst massacre went on to become one of the most important scientists Germany has ever produced. If your name is Gericke, or the older spelling Gericke, your bloodline didn't just survive a forgotten war. It walked out of the very worst night of that war, and, one experiment at a time, helped build the modern world that came after it. If your name showed up anywhere on this list, tell us exactly where in the comments, and tell us which one of these stories hit you the hardest. And if you want more of these buried pieces of German history dug out of the archives and put back in front of you where they belong, subscribe now, because the next name we uncover might already be sitting in your own family Bible, waiting for someone to finally sit down and ask what it actually means.